What's going on, guys? It's Rylan with Rylan's Amazing Photography, and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be talking about the right camera settings for wildlife photography. Wildlife photography can be difficult, and you really need to know your stuff. I'm going to cover everything from shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation. By the time you leave this video, you're going to know all of the right settings to use for your wildlife photography. Let's get right into it. Roll the intro. I'm going to start this video with the decade-old, conflict, RAW versus JPEG. I shoot RAW and JPEG personally for all of my photos, but when editing I always use the RAW photos because there's so much more dynamic range. If you don't know what dynamic range is, it's the difference between the brightest highlights in the image and the darkest shadows. Something that you're definitely going to want to note though is RAW takes so much longer to write photos than JPEG. So when shooting RAW, it might be better for you to use your fastest card and put your JPEG on your slower card because it really takes a long time to write those files, and it can really take your buffer on your camera a long time to catch up. Next, I'm going to talk about shutter speed. You always want to shoot at the slowest shutter speed possible that will freeze the motion, because otherwise you're introducing unnecessary noise to your image by not letting enough light into your camera. However, if you are shooting at too low of a shutter speed, things might seem fine at first, but once you zoom in 1:1, you're going to see that there's a pretty bad amount of motion blur that's absolutely destroying the sharpness of your photo. I like to start at a really high shutter speed and inspect my photos closely, then I slowly drop down the shutter speed slowly as I continue to take pictures. Your shutter speed is going to vary depending on the animals and birds that you are shooting and if they are moving. For example, if you're taking a shot of a hummingbird, you're probably going to have 1/8,000th of a shutter speed. But if you're shooting something like a bird of prey, like an eagle or an osprey, you can probably get your shutter speed down to about 1/500th of a second, which is pretty slow for moving wildlife. If you want to see some gorgeous wildlife and landscape photos, you can check out my book, Out of the Darkness. You can head over to blurb.com and search Out of the Darkness, or use either one of the links below to buy the ebook or hard copy versions. Camera modes. Manual mode is not always the best mode to get the job done, although it's personally one of my favorites. One of the best modes to get the job done for wildlife photography is shutter priority mode. Ideally, I want to get an animal in action, so I use shutter priority mode starting at a higher shutter speed. And then if I see an animal sitting still or a bird on a perch, I can just spin my dial really fast and get to a lower shutter speed and not have to worry about my aperture at the same time. You can also use auto ISO to make sure it's exposing your image properly, although keep in mind if you aren't shooting at full frame, auto ISO can really mess up your image and make it really noisy. Focusing mode. It really depends on the camera you have. I like to use continuous autofocus, but depending on what your subject is doing, you might need to use single point autofocus. My suggestion would be start working with continuous autofocus, and if that works for you, just stick with that. Focus point. For focus points, I like to use a single autofocus point in the middle of my frame. I also like to use the subject tracking with my Nikon D500 because it does a great job with birds in flight. With most DSLRs, however, I recommend using the single autofocus point in the middle of the frame because it's typically the most accurate. If you're shooting mirrorless, your subject tracking is probably pretty good, so I'll give it a shot too. Shutter mode. I'm always using continuous shutter on high speed when shooting wildlife. And even though there are other modes, I would recommend sticking with continuous at its highest setting because you're going to want to get every single frame of that bird flying towards you. Aperture. If you're shooting in shutter priority mode like I recommended at the beginning, it's completely taking care of your aperture anyways, and there's nothing to worry about. It should expose your photo properly. Now I think you know exactly how to use your camera settings when you're shooting wildlife photography. It might be challenging at first and it might feel like I just threw 1,000 things in your face. But search some tutorials for your specific camera. For example, if you're shooting with a Nikon D500 like I am, there are tons of tutorials on YouTube, online, just different things that can show you how to properly set up the best setup for your camera for wildlife photography. You can even get more specific and say bird photography, which pretty much everything I said in here applies to birds as well. It's very important that you know how to dial in your camera settings, because if you mess one little thing up, it can screw everything up, and you don't want that. You want to get the best wildlife shots that you can. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. If you are this far into the video and you haven't subscribed yet, why not? Also, definitely make sure that you like today's video because that helps me out a lot. If you would share this video with a friend, that would mean the absolute world to me. We are on the road to 1K. Last time I checked, I think we're around 540 subscribers. So if you all can help me get to 1K, that would be awesome. I'll be giving away a zombie filter set along with a soft cover copy of my book, Out of the Darkness. Speaking of which, if you're this far into the video, why not go ahead and buy Out of the Darkness, because it's a great book. You can see some awesome wildlife photos and nature photos. Once again, thank you all so much for watching today's video. It means the world to me, and I hope you guys have an absolute amazing, best day, amazing funness ever. Bye.